Chapter 9 of David Crockett, His Life and Adventures. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brett W. Downey. David Crockett, His Life and Adventures by John S.C. Abbott. Chapter 9. Adventures in the Forest, on the River, and in the City. Crockett was very fond of hunting adventures, and told stories of these enterprises in a racy way, peculiarly characteristic of the man. The following narrative, from his own lips, the reader will certainly peruse with much interest. I was sitting by a good fire in my little cabin, on a cool November evening, roasting potatoes, I believe, and playing with my children, when some one hallooed at the fence. I went out, and there were 3 strangers, who said they had come to take an elk hunt. I was glad to see 'em, invited 'em in, and after supper we cleaned our guns. I took down old Betsy, rubbed her up, greased her, and laid her away to rest. She's a mighty rough old piece, but I love her, for she and I have seen hard times. She mighty seldom tells me a lie. If I hold her right, she always sends the ball where I tell her. After we were all fixed, I told 'em hunting stories till bedtime. Next morning was clear and cold, and by times I sounded my horn, and my dogs came howling about me, ready for a chase. Old Rattler was a little lame. A bear bit him in the shoulder. But Soundwell, Tiger, and the rest of 'em were all mighty anxious. We got a bite, and saddled our horses. I went to git a neighbor to drive for us, and off we started for the Hurricane. My dogs looked mighty wolfish. They kept jumping on one another and growling. I knew they were run mad for a fight, for they hadn't had one for 2 or 3 days. We were in fine spirits, and going long through very open woods, when one of the strangers said, "I would give my horse now to see a bear." Said I, "Well, give me your horse," and I pointed to an old bear, about 300 or 400 yards ahead of us, feeding on acorns. I had been looking at him some time, but he was so far off, I wasn't certain what it was. However, I hardly spoke before we all strained off, and the woods fairly echoed as we harked the dogs on. The old bear didn't want to run, and he never broke till we got most upon him, but then he buckled for it, I tell you. When they overhauled him, he just reared up on his hind legs, and he boxed the dogs about at a mighty rate. He hugged old Tiger and another till he dropped 'em nearly lifeless, but the others worried him, and after a while they all come to, and they give him trouble. They are mighty apt, I'll tell you, to give a bear trouble before they leave him. 'Twas a mighty pretty fight. 'Twould have done any one's soul good to see it, just to see how they all rolled about. It was as much as I could do to keep the strangers from shooting him, but I wouldn't let 'em, for fear they would kill some of my dogs. After we got tired of seeing 'em fight, I went in among 'em, and the first time they got him down, I socked my knife in the old bear. We then hung him up, and went on to take our elk hunt. You never seed fellows so delighted as them strangers was. Blow me if they didn't cut more capers, jumping about, than the old bear. 'Twas a mighty pretty fight, but I believe I seed more fun looking at them than at the bear. By the time we got to the Hurricane, we were all rested, and ripe for a drive. My dogs were in a better humor, for the fight had taken off the wiry edge. So I placed the strangers at the stands through which I thought the elk would pass, sent the driver way up ahead, and I went down below. Everything was quiet, and I leaned old Betsy agin a tree and laid down. I suppose I had been lying there nearly an hour, when I heard old Tiger open. He opened once or twice, and old Rattler gave a long howl. The balance joined in, and I knew the elk were up. I jumped up and seized my rifle. I could hear nothing but one continuous roar of all my dogs, coming right towards me. Though I was an old hunter, the music made my hair stand on end. Soon after they first started, I heard one gun go off, and my dogs stopped. But not long, for they took a little tack towards where I had placed the strangers. One of them fired, and they dashed back, and circled round way to my left. I run down about a quarter of a mile, and I heard my dogs make a bend like they were coming to me. While I was listening, I heard the bushes breaking still lower down, and started to run there. As I was going along, I seed 2 elks burst out of the Hurricane about 130 or 40 yards below me. There was an old buck and a doe. I stopped, waited till they got into a clear place, and as the old fellow made a leap, I raised old Bet, pulled trigger, and she spoke out. The smoke blinded me so that I couldn't see what I did, but as it cleared away, I caught a glimpse of only one of them going through the bushes, so I thought I had the other. I went up, and there lay the old buck kicking. I cut his throat, and by that time Tiger and two of my dogs came up. I thought it singular that all my dogs wasn't there, and I began to think they had killed another. After the dogs had bit him, and found out he was dead, old Tiger began to growl, and curl himself up between his legs. Everything had to stand off then, for he wouldn't let the devil himself touch him. I started off to look for the strangers. My two dogs followed me. After getting away a piece, I looked back, and once in a while I could see old Tiger get up and shake the elk, to see if he was really dead, and then curl up between his legs again. I found the strangers round a doe elk the driver had killed, and one of them said he was sure he had killed one lower down. I asked him if he had horns. He said he didn't see any. I put the dogs on where he said he had shot, and they didn't go fur before they came to a halt. I went up, and there lay a fine buck elk, and though his horns were 4 or 5 feet long, the fellow who shot him was so scared that he never saw him. We had 3 elk and a bear, and we managed to get it home, then butchered our game, talked over our hunt, and had a glorious frolic. Crockett served in the legislature for 2 years, during which time nothing occurred of special interest. These were the years of 1823 and 1824. Colonel Alexander was then the representative, in the national legislature, of the district in which Crockett lived. He had offended his constituents by voting for the tariff. It was proposed to run Crockett for Congress in opposition to him. Crockett says, "I told the people that I could not stand that. It was a step above my knowledge, and I knowed nothing about Congress matters." They persisted, but he lost the election, for cotton was very high, and Alexander urged that it was in consequence of the tariff. 2 years passed away, which Crockett spent in the wildest adventures of hunting. He was a true man of the woods, with no ambition for any better home than the log cabin he occupied. There was no excitement so dear to him as the pursuit and capture of a grizzly bear. There is nothing on record, in the way of hunting, which surpasses the exploits of this renowned bear hunter. There is a certain degree of sameness in these narratives of skill and endurance which would weary the reader. In the fall of 1825, Crockett built 2 large flat boats, to load with staves for the making of casks, which he intended to take down the river to market. He employed a number of hands in building the boat and splitting out the staves, and engaged himself in these labors "till the bears got fat." He then plunged into the woods, and in 2 weeks killed 15. The whole winter was spent in hunting with his son and his dogs. His workmen continued busy getting the staves, and when the rivers rose with the spring floods, he had 30,000 ready for the market. With this load he embarked for New Orleans. His boats without difficulty floated down the Obion into the majestic Mississippi. It was the first time he had seen the rush of these mighty waters. There was before him a boat voyage of nearly 1,500 miles, through regions to him entirely unknown. In his own account of this adventure, he writes, "When I got into the Mississippi, I found all my hands were bad scared. In fact, I believe I was scared a little worst of any, for I had never been down the river, and I soon discovered that my pilot was as ignorant of the business as myself. I hadn't gone far before I determined to lash the 2 boats together. We did so, but it made them so heavy and obstinate that it was next akin to impossible to do anything at all with them, or to guide them right in the river. That evening we fell in company with some Ohio boats, and about night we tried to land, but we could not. The Ohio men hollered to us to go on and run all night. We took their advice, though we had a good deal rather not. But we couldn't do any other way. In a short distance we got into what is called the Devil's Elbow, and if any place in the wide creation has its own proper name, I thought it was this. Here we had about the hardest work that I was ever engaged in my life, to keep out of danger, and even then we were in it all the while. We twice attempted to land at Wood Yards, which we could see but couldn't reach. The people would run out with lights, and try to instruct us how to get to shore, but all in vain. Our boats were so heavy that we could not take them much any way except the way they wanted to go, and just the way the current would carry them. At last we quit trying to land, and concluded just to go ahead as well as we could, for we found we couldn't do any better. Sometime in the night I was down in the cabin of one of the boats, sitting by the fire, thinking on what a hobble we had got into, and how much better bear hunting was on hard land than floating along on the water, when a fellow had to go ahead whether he was exactly willing or not. The hatchway of the cabin came slap down, right through the top of the boat, and it was the only way out, except a small hole in the side, which we had used for putting our arms through to dip up water before we lashed the boats together. We were now floating sideways, and the boat I was in was the hindmost as we went. All at once I heard the hands begin to run over the top of the boat in great confusion, and pull with all their might. And the first thing I knowed after this, we went broadside, full tilt against the head of an island, where a large raft of drift timber had lodged. The nature of such a place would be, as everybody knows, to suck the boats down and turn them right under this raft. And the uppermost boat would, of course, be sucked down and go under first. As soon as we struck, I bulged from my hatchway, as the boat was turning under, sure enough. But when I got to it, the water was pouring in through a current as large as the hole would let it, and as strong as the weight of the river would force it. Found I couldn't get out here, for the boat was now turned down in such a way that it was steeper than a housetop. I now thought of the hole in the side, and made my way in a hurry for that. With difficulty I got to it, and when I got there, I found it was too small for me to get out by my own power, and I began to think that I was in a worse box than ever. But I put my arms through, and hollered as loud as I could roar, as the boat I was in hadn't yet quite filled with water up to my head, and the hands, who were next to the raft, seeing my arms out and hearing me holler, seized them and began to pull. I told them I was sinking, and to pull my arms off, or to force me through, for now I knowed well enough it was neck or nothing, come out or sink. By a violent effort they jerked me through, but I was in a pretty pickle when I got through. I had been sitting without any clothing over my shirt. This was torn off, and I was literally skinned like a rabbit. I was, however, well pleased to get out in any way, even without shirt or hide. As before I could straighten myself on the boat next to the raft, the one they'd pulled me out of went entirely under, and I have never seen it any more to this day. We all escaped onto the raft, where we were compelled to sit all night, about a mile from land on either side. 4 of my company were bareheaded, and 3 barefooted, and of that number I was one. I reckon I looked a pretty cracklin' ever to get to Congress. We had now lost all our loading, and every particle of our clothing, except what little we had on. But over all this, while I was sitting there, in the night, floating about on the drift, I felt happier and better off than I ever had in my life before, for I had just made such a marvelous escape, that I had forgot almost everything else in that, and so I felt prime. In the morning about sunrise, we saw a boat coming down, and we hailed her. They sent a large skiff, and took us all aboard, and carried us down as far as Memphis. Here I met with a friend that I never can forget as long as I am able to go ahead at anything. It was a Major Winchester, a merchant of that place. He let us all have hats and shoes and some little money to go upon, and so we all parted. A young man and myself concluded to go on down to Natchez, to see if we could hear anything of our boats, for we supposed they would float out from the raft, and keep on down the river. We got on a boat at Memphis, that was going down, and so cut out. Our largest boat, we were informed, had been seen about 50 miles below where we stove, and an attempt had been made to land her, but without success, as she was as hard-headed as ever. This was the last of my boats, and of my boating, for it went so badly with me along at the first, that I had not much mind to try it any more. I now returned home again, and, as the next August was the Congressional election, I began to turn my attention a little to that matter, as it was beginning to be talked of a good deal among the people. Cotton was down very low. Crockett could now say to the people, "You see the effects of the tariff?" There were 2 rival candidates for the office, Colonel Alexander and General Arnold. Money was needed to carry the election, and Crockett had no money. He resolved, however, to try his chances. A friend loaned him a little money to start with, which sum Crockett, of course, expended in whiskey, as the most potent influence, then and there, to secure an election. "So I was able," writes Crockett, "to buy a little of the creature, to put my friends in a good humor, as well as the other gentlemen, for they all treat in that country, not to get elected, of course, for that would be against the law, but just to make themselves and their friends feel they are keeping a little." The contest was, as usual, made up of drinking, feasting, and speeches. Colonel Alexander was an intelligent and worthy man, who had been public surveyor. General Arnold was a lawyer of very respectable attainments. Neither of these men considered Crockett a candidate in the slightest degree to be feared. They only feared each other, and tried to circumvent each other. On one occasion there was a large gathering, where all 3 of the candidates were present, and each one was expected to make a speech. It came Crockett's lot to speak first. He knew nothing of congressional affairs, and had sense enough to be aware that it was not best for him to attempt to speak upon subjects of which he was entirely ignorant. He made one of his funny speeches, very short and entirely noncommittal. Colonel Alexander followed, endeavoring to grapple with the great questions of tariffs, finance, and internal improvements which were then agitating the nation. General Arnold then, in his turn, took the stump, opposing the measures which Colonel Alexander had left. He seemed entirely to ignore the fact that Crockett was a candidate. Not the slightest allusion was made to him in his speech. The nervous temperament predominated in the man, and he was easily annoyed. While speaking, a large flock of guinea hens came along, whose peculiar and noisy cry all will remember who have ever heard it. Arnold was greatly disturbed, and at last requested someone to drive the fowls away. As soon as he had finished his speech, Crockett again mounted the stump, and ostensibly addressing Arnold, but really addressing the crowd, said, in a loud voice, but very jocosely, "Well, General, you are the first man I ever saw that understood the language of fowls. You had not the politeness even to allude to me in your speech. But when my little friends, the guinea hens, came up and began to holler, 'Crockett, Crockett, Crockett,' you were ungenerous enough to drive them all away." This raised such a universal laugh that even Crockett's opponents feared that he was getting the best of them in winning the favor of the people. When the day of the election came, the popular bear hunter beat both of his competitors by 2,747 votes. Thus David Crockett, unable to read and barely able to sign his name, became a member of Congress, to assist in framing laws for the grandest republic earth has ever known. He represented a constituency of about 100,000 souls. An intelligent gentleman, traveling in West Tennessee, finding himself within 8 miles of Colonel Crockett's cabin, decided to call upon the man whose name had now become quite renowned. This was just after Crockett's election to Congress, but before he had set out for Washington. There was no road leading to the lonely hut. He followed a rough and obstructed path or trail, which was indicated only by blazed trees, and which bore no marks of being often traveled. At length he came to a small opening in the forest, very rude and uninviting in its appearance. It embraced 8 or 10 acres. One of the humblest and least tasteful of log huts stood in the center. It was truly a cabin, a mere shelter from the weather. There was no yard. There were no fences. Not the slightest effort had been made towards ornamentation. It would be difficult to imagine a more lonely and cheerless abode. 2 men were seated on stools at the door, both in their shirt sleeves, engaged in cleaning their rifles. As the stranger rode up, one of the men rose and came forward to meet him. He was dressed in very plain homespun attire, with a black fur cap upon his head. He was a finely proportioned man, about 6 feet high, apparently 45 years of age, and of very frank, pleasing, open countenance. He held his rifle in his hand, and from his right shoulder hung a bag made of raccoon skin, to which there was a sheath attached containing a large butcher knife. "This is Colonel Crockett's residence, I presume," said the stranger. "Yes," was the reply, with a smile as of welcome. "Have I the pleasure of seeing that gentleman before me?" the stranger added. "If it be a pleasure," was the courtly reply, "you have, sir." "Well, Colonel," responded the stranger, "I have ridden much out of my way to spend a day or 2 with you and take a hunt." "Get down, sir," said the Colonel cordially. "I am delighted to see you. I like to see strangers, and the only care I have is that I cannot accommodate them as well as I could wish. I have no corn, but my little boy will take your horse over to my son-in-law's. He is a good fellow, and will take care of him." Leading the stranger into his cabin, Crockett very courteously introduced him to his brother, his wife, and his daughters. He then added, "You see we are mighty rough here. I am afraid you will think it hard times, but we have to do the best we can. I started mighty poor, and have been rooting long ever since. But I hate apologies. What I live upon always, I think a friend can do for a day or 2. I have but little, but that little is as free as the water that runs. So make yourself at home." Mrs. Crockett was an intelligent and capable woman for one in her station in life. The cabin was clean and orderly, and presented a general aspect of comfort. Many trophies of the chase were in the house, and spread around the yard. Several dogs, looking like war-worn veterans, were sunning themselves in various parts of the premises. All the family were neatly dressed in homemade garments. Mrs. Crockett was a grave, dignified woman, very courteous to her guests. The daughters were remarkably pretty, but very diffident. Though entirely uneducated, they could converse very easily, seeming to inherit their father's fluency of utterance. They were attractive and efficient in aiding their mother in her household work. Colonel Crockett, with much apparent pleasure, conducted his guest over the small patch of ground he had grubbed and was cultivating. He exhibited his growing peas and pumpkins, and his little field of corn, with as much apparent pleasure as an Illinois farmer would now point out his hundreds of acres of waving grain. The hunter seemed surprisingly well informed. As we have mentioned, nature had endowed him with unusual strength of mind, and with a memory which was almost miraculous. He never forgot anything he had heard. His electioneering tours had been to him very valuable schools of education. Carefully he listened to all the speeches and the conversation of the intelligent men he met with. John Quincy Adams was then in the presidential chair. It was the year 1827. Nearly all Crockett's constituents were strong Jackson men. Crockett, who afterward opposed Jackson, subsequently said, speaking of his views at the time, "I can say on my conscience that I was, without disguise, the friend and supporter of General Jackson upon his principles, as he had laid them down, and as I understood them, before his election as President." Alluding to Crockett's political views at the time, his guest writes, "I held in high estimation the present administration of our country. To this he was opposed. His views, however, delighted me, and were they more generally adopted, we should be none the loser. He was opposed to the administration, and yet conceded that many of its acts were wise and efficient, and would have received his cordial support. He admired Mr. Clay, but had objections to him. He was opposed to the tariff, yet I think a supporter of the United States Bank. He seemed to have the most horrible objection to binding himself to any man or set of men. He said, 'I would as lieve be an old coon dog as obliged to do what any man or set of men would tell me to do. I will support the present administration as far as I would any other, that is, as far as I believe its views to be right. I will pledge myself to support no administration. I had rather be politically damned than hypocritically immortalized.'" In the winter of 1827, Crockett emerged from his cabin in the wilderness for a seat in Congress. He was so poor that he had not money enough to pay his expenses to Washington. His election had cost him $150, which a friend had loaned him. The same friend advanced $100 more to help him on his journey. "When I left home," he says, "I was happy, devilish, and full of fun. I bade adieu to my friends, dogs, and my rifle, and took the stage, where I met with much variety of character, and amused myself when my humor prompted. Being fresh from the backwoods, my stories amused my companions, and I passed my time pleasantly. When I arrived at Raleigh, the weather was cold and rainy, and we were all dull and tired. Upon going into the tavern, where I was an entire stranger, the room was crowded, and the crowd did not give way that I might come to the fire. I was rooting my way to the fire, not in a good humor, when some fellow staggered up towards me and cried out, 'Hooray for Adams!' Said I, 'Stranger, you had better hurrah for hell, and praise your own country.' 'And who are you?' said he. I replied, 'I am that same David Crockett, fresh from the backwoods, half horse, half alligator, and a little touched with the snapping turtle. I can wade the Mississippi, leap the Ohio, ride upon a streak of lightning, and slip without a scratch down a honey locust. I can whip my weight in wildcats, and, if any gentleman pleases, for a $10 bill he can throw in a panther. I can hug a bear too close for comfort, and eat any man opposed to General Jackson.' All eyes were immediately turned towards this strange man, for all had heard of him. A place was probably made for him at the fire. He was afterward asked if this wondrous outburst of slang was entirely unpremeditated. He said that it was, that it had all popped into his head at once, and that he should never have thought of it again, had not the story gone the round of the newspapers. "I came on to Washington," he says, "and drawed $250, and purchased with it a check on the bank in Nashville, and enclosed it to my friend. And I may say in truth I sent this money with a mighty good will, for I reckon nobody in this world loves a friend better than me, or remembers a kindness longer." Soon after his arrival at Washington, he was invited to dine with President Adams, a man of the highest culture, whose manners had been formed in the courts of Europe. Crockett, totally unacquainted with the usages of society, did not know what the note of invitation meant, and inquired of a friend, the Honorable Mr. Verplanck. He says, "I was wild from the backwoods, and didn't know nothing about eating dinner with the big folks of our country. And how should I, having been a hunter all my life? I had eat most of my dinners on a log in the woods, and sometimes no dinner at all. I knew whether I ate dinner with the President or not was a matter of no importance, for my constituents were not to be benefited by it. I did not go to court the President, for I was opposed to him in principle, and had no favors to ask at his hands. I was afraid, however, I should be awkward, as I was so entirely a stranger to fashion, and in going along I resolved to observe the conduct of my friend Mr. Verplanck, and to do as he did, and I know that I did behave myself right well." Some cruel wag wrote the following ludicrous account of this dinner party, which went the round of all the papers as veritable history. The writer pretended to quote Crockett's own account of the dinner. "The first thing I did," said Davy, "after I got to Washington, was to go to the President's. I stepped into the President's house. Thinks I, who's afeard? If I didn't, I wish I may be shot. Says I, 'Mr. Adams, I am Mr. Crockett, from Tennessee.' 'So,' says he, 'how d'ye do, Mr. Crockett?' And he shook me by the hand, although he knowed I went the whole hog for Jackson. If he didn't, I wish I may be shot. Not only that, but he sent me a printed ticket to dine with him. I've got it in my pocket yet. I went to dinner, and I walked all around the long table, looking for something that I liked. At last, I took my seat beside a fat goose, and I helped myself to as much of it as I wanted. But I hadn't took 3 bites when I looked away up the table at a man they called Tash (attaché). He was talking French to a woman on t'other side of the table. He dodged his head, and she dodged hers, and then they got to drinking wine across the table. But when I looked back again my plate was gone, goose and all. So I just cast my eyes down to the other end of the table, and sure enough I seed a white man walking off with my plate. I says, 'Hello, mister, bring back my plate.' He fetched it back in a hurry, as you may think, and when he set it down before me, how do you think it was? Licked as clean as my hand. If it wasn't, I wish I may be shot. Says he, 'What will you have, sir?' And says I, 'You may well say that after stealing my goose.' And he began to laugh. Then says I, 'Mister, laugh if you please, but I don't half like sich tricks upon travellers.' I then filled my plate with bacon and greens, and whenever I looked up or down the table, I held on to my plate with my left hand. When we were all done eating, they cleared everything off the table and took away the tablecloth. And what do you think? There was another cloth under it. If there wasn't, I wish I may be shot. Then I saw a man coming along, carrying a great glass thing, with a glass handle below, something like a candlestick. It was stuck full of little glass cups, with something in them that looked good to eat. Says I, 'Mister, bring that thing here.' Thinks I, let's taste them first. They were mighty sweet and good, so I took 6 of them. If I didn't, I wish I may be shot." This humorous fabrication was copied into almost every paper in the Union. The more respectable portion of Crockett's constituents were so annoyed that their representative should be thus held up to the contempt of the nation, that Crockett felt constrained to present a reliable refutation of the story. He therefore obtained and published certificates from 3 gentlemen, testifying to his good behavior at the table. Honorable Mr. Verplanck of New York testified as follows: "I dined at the President's, at the time alluded to, in company with you, and I had, I recollect, a good deal of conversation with you. Your behavior there was, I thought, perfectly becoming and proper, and I do not recollect or believe that you said or did anything resembling the newspaper account." 2 other members of Congress were equally explicit in their testimony. During Crockett's first 2 sessions in Congress he got along very smoothly, cooperating generally with what was called the Jackson party. In 1829 he was again re-elected by an overwhelming majority. On the 4th of March of this year Andrew Jackson was inaugurated President of the United States. It may be doubted whether there ever was a more honest, conscientious man in Congress than David Crockett. His celebrated motto, "Be sure that you are right, and then go ahead," seemed ever to animate him. He could neither be menaced or bribed to support any measure which he thought to be wrong. Ere long he found it necessary to oppose some of Jackson's measures. We will let him tell the story in his own truthful words. "Soon after the commencement of this second term, I saw, or thought I did, that it was expected of me that I would bow to the name of Andrew Jackson, and follow him in all his motions, and windings, and turnings, even at the expense of my conscience and judgment. Such a thing was new to me, and a total stranger to my principles. I'd knowed well enough, though, that if I didn't hurrah for his name, the hue and cry was to be raised against me, and I was to be sacrificed if possible. His famous, or rather I should say his infamous Indian bill, was brought forward, and I opposed it from the purest motives in the world. Several of my colleagues got around me, and told me how well they loved me, and that I was ruining myself. They said this was a favorite measure of the President, and I ought to go for it. I told them I believed it was a wicked, unjust measure, and that I should go against it, let the cost to myself be what it might. That I was willing to go with General Jackson in everything that I believed was honest and right, but further than this I wouldn't go for him or any other man in the whole creation. I had been elected by a majority of 3,585 votes, and I believed they were honest men, and wouldn't want me to vote for any unjust notion, to please Jackson or any one else. At any rate, I was of age, and determined to trust them. I voted against this Indian bill, and my conscience yet tells me that I gave a good, honest vote, and one that I believe will not make me ashamed in the day of judgment. I served out my term, and though many amusing things happened, I am not disposed to swell my narrative by inserting them. When it closed, and I returned home, I found the storm had raised against me sure enough, and it was echoed from side to side, and from end to end of my district, that I had turned against Jackson. This was considered the unpardonable sin. I was hunted down like a wild varmint, and in this hunt every little newspaper in the district, and every little pin-hook lawyer was engaged. Indeed, they were ready to print anything and everything that the ingenuity of man could invent against me. In consequence of this opposition, Crockett lost his next election, and yet by a majority of but 70 votes. For 2 years he remained at home, hunting bears. But having once tasted the pleasures of political life and the excitements of Washington, his silent rambles in the woods had lost much of their ancient charms. He was again a candidate at the ensuing election, and, after a very warm contest, gained the day by a majority of 202 votes. End of chapter. Recording by Downey.